morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin O'Connor, and I'm a director here at New London Architecture. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Housing Retrofit, Best Practice for Low Carbon Solutions. Our homes have become a central focus when discussing climate targets, with statistics showing that homes produce 13% of all carbon emissions in the UK. As a result, retrofitting our old building stock is now recognised as a top priority by many working in the built environment sector. However, with such a large task ahead, we're still facing technical challenges and a lack of knowledge on how to retrofit older properties effectively. Today, we'll be hearing from leading experts in the industry, shedding valuable insight into what is needed to make our homes more sustainable and energy efficient. This event is part of our year-round Conservation and Heritage programme, so do look at our website for similar events. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end, and you can do this by using the Zoom Q&A function, and do post those questions throughout, and I will get to as many of those at the end. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, and that is Dougie Phillips, who's Senior Environment Analyst at Historic England. Dougie, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for asking me to speak today. It's really good to be here. I'm Douglas Phillips. I'm the Senior Environmental Analyst at Historic England, and I've been asked to talk today about our work in reducing carbon emissions in traditional homes. So I thought I'd start with a quote, and mainly because I like starting with quotes, but I feel this sort of encapsulates the reasons why we're here today, and that the greenest building is the one that already exists. And it really sort of makes a case and sort of that need to keep and retain traditional and heritage buildings and the environmental impact that sort of relates to that. I've been asked to talk about a report that we published back in March called Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon, which is a part of our Heritage Count Suite, which is produced by Historic England on behalf of the Historic Environment Forum. And if you're not aware, Heritage Counts looks to bring together trends, insights and data which are in support of the heritage sector. And for the last 2 years, the focus has been on retrofit. So although the Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon report was published in March, it's actually 2 years in the making, with lots of sort of background research and evidence generation which has gone into this. So in 2019, our Heritage Council looked at embodied carbon and making the case for why retrofit and retrofitting buildings from an embodied carbon perspective is important. And then building upon that, we've commissioned other research looking more at the operational energy and the retrofit measures which can go to reducing that. So it's very much a collaborative and robust piece of evidence. And if you aren't aware of it and haven't read it, then I implore you to go and visit our website to sort of look at that report, but also all of the research reports that support that. And there's so much evidence which has gone into it, and probably more than I could talk to you in a whole day of a presentation. So keeping it to 15 minutes is going to be tough. But all of that's published and is free to sort of access. So to start with some context, buildings are the 3rd largest carbon emission producer in the UK, and homes actually account for a significant proportion of that. Homes are also the 2nd largest consumers of energy, with around 65% of this going into space heating. So when we start to think of net zero targets and reducing our emissions, it becomes blatantly obvious why retrofit is an important thing to go down. But energy use in homes is complex, and there are multiple factors which will impact upon that. So the building's location, its orientation, design, construction and services. But in addition to those physical aspects, also the way the building is used, the way it's managed and maintained, all of these will impact upon the energy use of our homes. Adding to that, the fact that buildings are diverse, and there's a lovely picture there of Newcastle. I probably should have put London in, but I opted for Newcastle. And there's some bonus points for anyone who can point out which one's the listed building. But our buildings are diverse, and the UK's building stock is the oldest in Europe and is super diverse. So as a result, traditional built buildings differ from modern buildings. generally they're built with solid walls, so it'll be materials such as local source stone or bricks or even timber frames, and they don't have that additional insulation that modern buildings would have. They also tend to be built from porous materials so that moisture can move around, and I'll probably get told off using the word breathability, but they're more breathable. There's also a slower temperature changes associated with traditional buildings. They take longer to heat up than to cool down. And there's also more natural ventilation. So the way a traditional building interacts with its environment will be different from that of a modern building. So when we start to apply energy efficiency measures, they may react differently, and that's a sort of factor to think about. To add to that complexity, traditional buildings differ from one another. So, well, 21% of England's building stock is pre-1919. I've not got the figure for London, but it's higher than that. And of those pre-1919 buildings, about half are terraced, and so they'll be built from different materials. And the approach to retrofitting a terraced house would be different from how you would approach converted flat or even detached or semi-detached house. So it is a complex thing, and if it was simple, I probably wouldn't be sat here sort of telling you about what we need to do and how we should go about doing that. It would be probably more of oh, weren't we brilliant in what we've done? So it is a complex aspect. And to ensure that we get that we're successful in what we achieve, there are lots of sort of evidence and data out there which supports that. So as I said, the Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon document, it sort of brings together 2 years worth of research into one place. And so, as I say, there's more than so much more than I've got time to go into, but I wanted to pick up on some of the sort of key aspects of that. And first and foremost, it's important to fully understand what you have. And as an organisation, we do put a lot of value on heritage, but that's because heritage has a value to it. And if you're interested in that aspect, we have a heritage and economy document which sort of shows the values of heritage. But notwithstanding that, the fact that once something's gone, it's gone is a really important element. So it should really feature in the approaches that we take to retrofit. On top of it, the way the buildings are built, what they're built from, and importantly, the condition that the building is in, it needs to be considered. Elements such as heat, air, light, and water will behave differently in a building. So understanding that is important, and also how the services within that building work. And there's also a question around perceptions of comfort, and not just how that we perceive comfort now, but how will that change in a changing climate. It's also important to think of what retrofit option you're thinking about, and what's its likely effectiveness, and what value you can achieve from that. And again, in the Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon, we look to sort of put forward the data and evidence which would allow somebody or homeowner to look at that. And there's a balance to be made of what that reward is against the risks of potentially doing something wrong. And I'm not saying you don't do it, but it's important to have that sort of conversation of that risk and reward against what you're thinking of doing and what those impacts are, just because it will then allow you to sort of mitigate those issues. But undoubtedly, if done well, retrofit can reduce the operational carbon of traditional homes. And this slide, it's really hard to put an entire research report into one slide. So this is work done by the University of West of England. And again, this report is available to download and go through. But it effectively looked at the traditional building stock, which is about, I think it's about 4 million homes, and how you can get those to net zero. And I've talked about the diversity of the building stock, and trying to model that level of diversity is a difficult thing to do. So with this research, they look to define 5 archetypes, which would be best representative of that set of buildings. And they then modelled the impact of applying retrofit measures. And they looked at elements such as deployment rates, costs, obviously emission savings, and it's a really sort of comprehensive piece of work. And some of the bits that I'd want to pick up on is that that in the case of traditional buildings, reducing emissions significantly is very much achievable. So in the case of a small 1900s mid-terrace in Sheffield, you can achieve a 58% reduction, 1.5 tonnes of CO2 annual emission savings in relation to this. And it's also important to note that this is that 58% reduction is in the heating source moved from gas to electricity. So it's ready for hopefully the continued decarbonisation of the electricity grid, which would then see those emission reductions continue. It's important that we're open and honest about how much retrofit costs, and it is a costly and potentially disruptive challenge. And there's a lot of sort of influential research that doesn't fully take into consideration the costs, and those costs are understated. So they may cover just the costs of materials and labour, but they'll often forget about the other additional bits. So this research looked to include that as well, and include that uplift. I think they opted for a 95% uplift, which is quite high. So it could be lower than that when you consider economies of scale and stuff like that. But it's important that those aspects are captured within it, and the cost of retrofit are sort of properly talked about, because if we don't talk about it properly, then we're not going to be successful. There's an element which is it's often missed, in that retrofit and those measures do have embodied emissions, and they should be considered. This piece of research relates back to the work that Carrick did. And again, it looked at a bunch of case studies and calculated the embodied carbon emissions from the measures put in place. So in relation to the small 1900s mid-terrace in Manchester that they looked at, so this is separate from the other work, it achieved 1.2 tonnes of CO2 annual savings, but there were embodied carbon emissions associated with what went in place. And although it would only take a few years for those savings to sort of pay that carbon debt, when you start to add all those numbers up in a national level, if we're talking 4 million houses, for example, that's a large amount of embodied carbon, which is often ignored. And there are things that you can do to reduce the embodied carbon of retrofit. And again, those are some elements that are covered in the report, Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon. But it's an important thing that isn't really being talked about as much as it should be. And yeah, it's something that's highlighted there. And the bit that I'd like to sort of save for the end, and I don't know how I'm doing for time, is that 40% of the planned carbon emission reductions require a change in people's behaviour. And I think it really makes the point that retrofit should be an holistic approach, and where the user is considered. And when you look at the National Grid's projections, future energy scenario projections, consumer behaviour and changes to consumer behaviour are a key element of that. So it's really important that we engage with the users of buildings to make sure that we're bringing them with us, because there's no point in putting all these things in place if we're not taking the users of those buildings with us. We could put in smart monitors and stuff like that, but if the user doesn't know how to use them properly, then you're not going to get those benefits. So it's really important, and that people will play a crucial role in our low carbon future. Yet in a survey done by National Grid 2 years ago, only 5% of the public identified heating buildings as one of the more significant contributors to UK carbon emissions. So there's definitely more we can do in sort of communicating how important it is reducing our emissions in our home, and that small changes in people's behaviour and low impact measures can accumulate to make big differences. And the model data there on the right, it's probably best to just sort of take it as an indicative thing. It's based on sort of one set of model parameters, but it does show that how little changes in behaviour can start to accumulate up to make significant changes, which then, in line with retrofit measures, can help us get to where we want to be. There's also plenty that I'd like to say about repair and maintaining and elements like that. And Historic England has loads of guidance when it comes to looking after historic buildings and traditional buildings, and by all means, please go onto the website and check that out. But our published work and that evidence base that we have as a result of Know Your Home, Know Your Carbon. Again, it's sort of all free to access, and please do go and access that. I don't know, I think I might have been a bit too quick there, but yeah, thank you for listening to me. And yeah, if you have any questions, please do contact me.
Thank you very much, Dougie. You're pretty much bang on time there. It was a really fascinating presentation and piece of research. As Dougie said, you can go and download that piece of research. All of the presentations from today will also be available on our website after the event. For those of you who have just joined during Dougie's presentation, please do post your questions throughout the event, and I'll try and get to as many of those as possible during the panel discussion. I'd now like to hand over to Marion Bailey, who's partner at PDP London, who will give us more insight into retrofitting Victorian homes. Marion. Are you there, Marion? You might be on mute.
I'm sorry. Good morning, everybody. Hope you can hear me now. I'm going to present a few slides on the retrofitting of heritage buildings, primarily in central London, which is what PDP London do best. And first, as a kind of context, obviously, you've heard in the news all the importance of the fact that climate change is no longer a thing of the future, but a thing of the present. And this is just as a quick reminder of the purpose of the retrofit mission is to descend that mountain that we've climbed over the last century or so. So you can see that red line is what we need to descend. So as for any climbing experience, we need to be well equipped. And this is what my talk mostly is going to be about, is about having the knowledge to descend that mountain. So I'm going to go very quickly on these big picture slides because Dougie has really mostly mentioned everything that I'm saying in these slides here, perhaps with a tiny bit of a difference in the actual percentages. However, the message is the same. It's extremely important to address our existing stock, and in particular our residential stock, which is approximately 28% directly linked to CO2 emission of the whole country. So we as architects have a major responsibility and role to play in addressing climate change. And also, as Doug said, out of all the countries in Europe, we are the one who are the champions of the oldest housing stock in the whole of Europe, with close to 55% of our stock, which is pre-1960. So we have a particular challenge, but we also have a beautiful heritage. So we need to address it with this in mind. Changing habits. This is definitely one major task that each of us have to acknowledge and embrace. So while in the 19th century we were emitting carbon emission, but also having a comfort criteria which was a lot lesser than today. We didn't expect 21 degrees in our homes. We just wore a lot of clothes and hats indoors. In the 20th century, we started to kit out all our properties and dig pipelines from the North Sea to bring gas to our own homes. This is no longer feasible, and thankfully, gradually, renewable energy are coming a little bit more available. So we were kind of able now to harness that renewable energy, and together with enhancing the performance of our home, we can achieve the standard of comfort that today we expect in our homes, which is vastly different to the past. So we expect 21 degrees and a relative humidity between 40 and 60%, for example. We need to do this sustainably, and renewable energy and fabric measures will help us to get there. Again, this is a typical Victorian house CO2 emission pie chart, and what we need to do really is to slash this pie chart by about 80% and primarily address the heating demand. So again, it will be all about fabric and our good old boiler. So we need to train to understand how we can do this. And these are some of the organizations that provide whole house building approach. And I would really encourage you to go on proper training. It's not something, doing a really good retrofit is not something that we can do by picking little bits of knowledge here and there. You really have to train, and you really have to learn how to build again. And it's all about, mostly about building physics. It's quite interesting if you're into this kind of thing, but definitely embark into a new learning curve to make good retrofits. I ought to mention that the whole decarbonization, since I started on the retrofit agenda about 10 years ago, the priority was to reduce the gas demand to heat our homes. But I've been very happy to see that in the last 10 years, the grid has really decarbonized extremely quickly, and the carbon intensity of electricity has really been slashed beyond anybody's best expectation, I would say. And if this is carrying on, then this is encouraging for retrofits, as we don't necessarily need to rely on gas, fossil fuel energy to power our homes. And I would like to read out this little sentence from Bob Lowe, posted on Passive House Trust website, which is, if the overriding goal is purely to reduce carbon over the long term, then if we electrify heat and hot water and completely decarbonize the grid, then we perhaps don't need to go that far in energy efficiency, as it would create the ACB carbon burn, which would be larger than the long-term carbon saving. In this case, the primary objective of any retrofit becomes making the property suitable for connection to a low zero energy source. So in a nutshell, should our goal simply be to make properties heat pump ready? So again, since I started 10 years ago, it's no longer about minimizing our use of gas. It's actually transforming our energy demand to come from fossil fuel gas to energy, electric energy. So as the grid decarbonizes, electricity becomes a lot more interesting. And with a heat pump technology, you don't necessarily need to insulate as much as we thought before with gas, but we just need to insulate and upgrade our fabric sufficiently to make a heat pump work. And a heat pump doesn't work with radiators as with gas that used to work at 60 degrees, but at 40 degrees. So we need to also address the issue of the radiators. And I've seen a question of the Q&A that I'd like to come back on later on, but this is a very pertinent question indeed. So what is retrofit? Retrofit is about a very careful balance between people's comfort criteria, services fitting, the required services, and perhaps addressing issues around the heat pump that we've just touched on, and obviously addressing the fabric, the windows and the solid walls. Breathability and moisture needs to be understood. And of course, it's about also addressing the heritage significance of our listed assets and what we are able to do for this particular buildings. So heritage significance needs to be, we're entering now in a very sensitive topic, is what do we do with our heritage and our 55% of buildings pre-1960s? What do we do with all these buildings and all these beautiful features? And I'm happy to say that there are solutions, but again, you need to understand building physics, you need to understand materials, and you need to also carefully negotiate your way to adapt perhaps some heritage features. And I will illustrate these points in a few examples. So this is a quick little video about Princedale Road, which is a certified passive house retrofit on a Victorian terrace in a conservation area, illustrating that we need to first insulate and then address the windows, ventilate properly with an MVHR, address the air tightness and draft proofness, and the core bridges to make sure there's no heat loss or surface condensation. So these 5 points, which I'm hoping are going to stop, sorry, are really key to, sorry, I'm just going to try to come back on this. So these are really the 5 key strategies that you need to implement for a good retrofit. So if you want to make sure that you have an approach that makes sense, these 5 key points are absolutely the fundamental of retrofitting. Okay. Okay. So retrofitting is a little bit like a low energy house, for the difference that you absolutely must tackle the issue of moisture. You can see in this image, which is one of our sites. It's a real building that we've been handed over in this state. Obviously, this is due to water ingress, but it just illustrates, the potential effect of moisture going really bad inside a building. Understanding that a wall breathes and dissipates moisture, and the moisture can come from either outside or inside, is absolutely fundamental to a retrofit. It needs to be modeled, and it needs to be understood as you can create condensation either on the surface, also interstitially between materials. So this is something that you will learn on one of the courses that I suggest that you go on to. So choosing the right material to upgrade your fabric will be also something that needs very careful attention. Retrofitting is complicated. It's not for the light-hearted. You definitely need to have a strategy. This is one of the diagrams that we at PDP London have put together to address the internal wall insulation and how you make a decision in what to do. So I'm not going to go through it, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that you need to really go step by step, very slowly, and understanding the effect of everything you're actually doing, and whether also it is a relevant building, for example, and what sort of material you can apply. This is another piece of our research, which is on internal wall insulation and what is the best insulation for what wall, what orientation, what sort of heritage significance level that particular elevation might have. So every building, as you all know, as architects, are all prototypes. So every retrofit is the same. So you need to really go and research all materials and whether you need to have it breathable, whether it's inside, outside, etc. We have also, since the 10 years I've been doing retrofitting, now have an additional challenge of the fire safety. And this research that you see on the screen here is all about materials that are non-flammable and also mostly breathable. So once you've understood moisture, you also need to add fire. And this is something that needs really, really careful attention, and something also you need to talk to your insurers about. So it's not impossible. We've done it, we've come across it, but it's just you need to be conscious of fire as well. This is, I'm just going to show you 3 examples. This is a listed Georgian retrofit in Bloomsbury by Pruitt Bisley Architects, and they have a facade made of lovely sash windows that are original. And this building has achieved very near NFIT passive house levels. So it just shows that in a conservation area, in a listed grade 2 building, you can achieve down to close to passive house and retrofit, which is NFIT. It's about looking at your fabric, investigating all opportunities for upgrading of the fabric and choosing the right material. So for example, where you don't really have very much space, you can use aerogel to insulate the window reveals. And then where you have a bit more space, you can use wood fiber. You can also insert here a secondary glazing made of vacuum glass, which is 7 mil thick. So very small, and it's just meant that the shutters had been pushed by 30 mils, but overall the aesthetic of the listed building has been maintained. Also the technology available to upgrade the fabric is really moving on quite a lot. For example, this is the Fineo on the left-hand side, which has just released a heritage range. So it's 7 mil of double glazing, ultra thin, or 6.7 here, achieving the performance of a triple glazing window. So it can be retrofitted in existing window frames. So it's definitely something that is a game changer in the industry. Alternatively, you also have Pilkington Spatia on the right-hand side, but it has a little protection cap on the glass that some conservation area officers don't really like, which Fineo doesn't have. So watch the technology, challenge the manufacturers, push them to do more research. This is the end product of the secondary glazing in that Bloomsbury house, and you can see the secondary glazing being installed very discreetly between the shutter and the existing refurbished single glazed sash window. So if, in a nutshell, if there is really one topic that is the most difficult to get through in listed building, is really the window and acceptance from conservation area officers to grant permission to either do a secondary glazing, or best, in my view, would be to insert vacuum glazing in the panes of the existing window frames. This is another one of our projects at PDP London, which is grade 1 listed. So it has the particularity to actually be an entire new build. However, it's a reconstruction from scratch because it's a site that had been bombed during the Second World War and rebuilt badly. So we rebuild it again properly. I've included it in these retrofit slides because we have actually detailed it into a retrofitting way. You can see in yellow here, which is the internal wall insulation. I know I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to speed through these few last slides, but these are an explanation of how we have constructed this facade as a retrofit, and the continuity, the air tightness, the insulation, and the window glazing system needs to be carefully thought through. This is another project which is grade 1 and 2 listed at Cambridge House, also known as the In and Out Club on Piccadilly, which is a mix of existing retrofit and new build. On this absolutely gorgeous projects, we've done extensive amount of research into building physics, and this internal wall insulation research was made for this project also. So it's not about necessarily, installing insulation in every single room. For example, this one, the significance of that room takes over the need to retrofit insulation. However, we have been managed to install the secondary glazing pane, which will do already still upgrade. And because the fact that the windows are a large element in sort of proportion to the facade, the upgrading of the fabric will still be significant. And you can see here how we approach buildings and how we categorize different windows and which ones are more significant than some others. So, it's always about context and your own projects. Finally, I'd like to highlight a couple of guidance documents. Obviously, you must read Dougie's Historic England report, which is extremely useful and very well put together. I'm also part of the Letty research groups, and we are releasing a retrofit guide sometime in September, so watch out for this. There is also a upcoming GLA guidance in September, which will be released as a guidance for all the boroughs in London in how to approach retrofitting their own stock. And this is a sort of a summary of how you must approach, or how you can approach retrofitting: survey, analyze, strategize, describe and specify, then implement on site. And then lastly, let's not forget monitor the performance of your building, and most importantly, also share your lessons learned. Come and do some talks. The LNA will be absolutely delighted to have you present your own projects at another webinar. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Marion. If you've got any questions, Marion, please do post them in the Q&A box for us. We're now going to hear from Lizzie Webster, who's co-founder and architect at Freya and Finley Architects, who were the winners of this year's Don't Move Improve Environmental Prize with Seagal House. Lizzie, over to you.
Hello. Hi, so my name's Lizzie. I am design director at Freya and Finley. And I'm going to talk to you today about our project that we submitted to the NLA Don't Move Improve. So we're talking less about kind of technical data, but more kind of a story about the building. This is the Seagal House. So this is one of the Walter Seagal houses based in Lewisham. This is an aerial view. We're in Lewisham at the moment, flying around a backland site that in the 70s was developed for self-builders. So our site was this house here, which is mainly in shadow, and the client, actually, we lived down the road, and they came and knocked on our studio door and said, can you work with us? So it's kind of, talk about sustainably sourcing local materials, local architect, local clients. So it was a great start to the project. The client had lived in this house, the Seagal House, for a number of years, but they were kind of outgrowing it with 2 young children. So what we were looking at doing was extending the house to provide some more kitchen, living and dining room space, but also children's den space that sits underneath the building. The buildings are quite unique. They are single-story kind of chalet type buildings. They were built on a plot by the homeowners themselves, designed by Walter Seagal. So Seagal had a modular design for a building that was to use as fewer specialist trades as possible, and people in the 1970s had the sites, they trained themselves up, and they built the houses themselves. So you can see here, these are the pictures of the existing building, all timber framed, all built on a modular framework of a grid of 600 mil. This is the space underneath the building, so it's single story because it's on the side of quite a steep hill, and this is inside. So you can see, it's had its time. It's looking slightly bruised around the edges, and we were asked to come in and have a look at the project and look at extending it. So this is a plan of the building. So as I said, all of these buildings were built to Walter Seagal's designs, his framework methodology, which was using locally sourced materials that were all off the shelf and that could be built by unskilled labor. So the access to the site is along this little alleyway. So it's about 1.2 meters wide. So again, access was a real challenge. And as you look at the floor plan of the building, this is the ground floor plan, or the only floor plan. The entrance was here, the kitchen was here. You can see it's very tiny compared to the rest of the size of the house. Dining room, living room, and then the bedrooms are located around here. The roof plan, we have a huge flat roof that was failing in areas, but the great thing about this was it's a cedar roof. And again, as the 1970s built houses, all of them generally using renewable resources, and also were quite pioneering in the use of sustainable building back in the 70s. Looking at the elevation, you can see here, this is looking from the street, so a single story looking from the front elevation. But then you can see from the side elevation, this is where the topography of the hills significantly slides down. So we have actually a huge undercroft underneath the building, which is getting quite wet. It was full with storage, and we wanted to look at opportunities to connect the living spaces to the garden, because you can see actually the garden is quite small and it was accessed via a balcony. So there was a bit of a disconnect between the building. You can see also here the external framework of the building is expressed. And so we wanted to keep that kind of design aesthetic throughout a new extension or form of extension. The section here again shows the existing building, and you can see here this is the ground floor level, and this was the undercroft area. The brief was to extend the building and also take on board, I don't know why that's not come through, but it will come through in the other slide, was to take on board the Walter Seagal methodology of using materials that were off the shelf, but also using some kind of grid or frame system to extend the building. These were the original drawings that were given out by Seagal. and they show the framework arrangement of the existing building here. You can see the gaps of the grid were on a 650 mil framework, which actually means it's quite difficult to get things through the existing doors of the building. You can't fit a washing machine through, you have to take the door module out. But that's one of the reasons why it was designed like that as well, was because the internal walls have the ability to move. So the idea was that as people occupied the space, they could move things around internally. So again, giving the homeowner ultimate control over their building, which I think is a form of sustainability in itself, having that use and ownership over the space, talking about not only thermal comfort, but physical comfort and living comfort. Here, again, this is I'm not sure that you can see a patchy slide. I can see a patchy slide, but this was an AXO view of the timber framework here. You can see here's a central post, the roof and the ground floor, and then the intermediate framework beneath. The only piece of specialist labour in the 70s that we used were the pile foundations. So this was somebody would come in, set up all the piles, and then it was up to the homeowners entirely by themselves to go ahead and build the rest of the houses. This is the plan, which I'll have to try and explain around to you. But if you can see here, this is the edge of the existing building here. And what we did was to increase the living areas, the kitchen, the dining room space, but also provide a homework study space, was we extended just to the side of the building. So this is the narrowest slot on the site. And to basically, we would use this passageway between the edge of the building and the boundary to create a new entrance, and then also create a dynamic staircase that would take you down to the garden. By doing this and opening up the side of the building within its modular form, we can really fully expand the kitchen and also create a much wider living space and dining room space that flowed across the boundary. Then we use this staircase to take you down to a little garden-facing study, which has a green roof over the top, and then that takes you out to the garden. So again, we didn't want to impact too much on the garden space and take up too much space there. So here you can see a sketch. This was a sketch section of how we imagine the spaces. This is the form of the extension. So this is a new entranceway. You come in here, you come up to the existing kitchen that's now extended slightly. You can see here we're also expressing the framework in our original concept diagrams of the existing modular framework, and then you step down here to the garden studio. You can also see how we've tucked a little dem space and play space for the children underneath the existing house. These were sketch views again, imagining as you come into the entranceway, you look up to the original building, you look down to this garden facing study, and then we've got a planted roof with views out above that as well. A view from the home studio looking back towards the main door. So this is this dynamic staircase. So this extension is only 1.2 meters. And again, from a sustainability methodology, we were trying not to significantly add gross internal area to the house, but actually marginally expand it, but make the existing spaces work much harder for us. So these are the plans. Actually, I'll go quickly to the ground floor plan. So this was the original entranceway. So we relocated the entranceway to coming through here. So this is the new entranceway, new hallway, coming along here, stepping up to the dining room and the kitchen, and then stepping down towards the garden-facing studio, which is here, and also inhabiting the undercroft of the existing building, creating a children's den space. The materiality. This is a section as well. So all of this is timber framed. We had screw piles, and we used concrete only for a retaining element of a wall, which was kind of guarding against the topography, but everything was used as a renewable material, green roof, and obviously highly insulated. The existing, when we looked at the material palette, the material choice was really important. So we used off-the-shelf materials. So we used birch plywood throughout internally. We also used OSB for lots of the internal joinery. Again, this was all materials that the client could source very quickly, very easily, and very cost efficiently. These were kind of some internal elevations of the spaces. Again, I'm not sure about some of those formulas. But again, here, this is kind of the setup for the design intent for the internal spaces. We didn't want it to feel radically different to the Seagal House. We wanted to use clues and information about the style and the material finishes we had within the existing building. That's materials like birch plywood, OSB, and externally we were using Sheets corrugated metal, again, very easy to go and obtain from your local merchants, but also very easy to fix if there's a problem. We use clay plaster for its breathability and its low toxin content on some of the internal walls. We had a green roof, birch ply internal, and OSB joinery. These, I'll just quickly flick through here. These were some site photographs. The site the build was fully choreographed by the client, so project managed, so in a very Seagal methodology again. Here you can see we're propping up the underside of the existing building. Here you can see this is the extent of the extension, so only 1.2 meters, so very, very, very minimal in terms of how much we're extending, but actually how much space we're scooping out. Here you can see this is Celine and Taryn. We had the benefit of our client being an architectural photographer, so he fully recorded the build. And you can see here kind of development as we progress through site. This is the garden studio kind of reaching its conclusion. The planted roof where we're on top inspecting kind of the view over Lewisham. Again, more progress photographs here as we're developing the internal spaces. This is the entrance as you walk through with a big picture window that looks out over a green roof. And you can see here, this is the existing side of the original building. And from a materiality point of view, we reused lots of the joinery within the existing building, which was being removed. So for example, most of the kitchen is made up from recycled cabinets. And again, you can see the board finish of the plywood was also used across the floor. So again, using as many panelized materials as possible. These are the final images, which I will fly through. So looking at from the entrance as you come in, looking from the outside here, so this is the extent of the extension, very, very small. And the original house is blue and black, and we inversed it. So the doors and the window frames are blue, and the rest of the cladding is black. So that's kind of a nice play on the original design of the existing building. Entrance here. This is the entrance as you come in. And these are the undercroft spaces in the home studio that faces out into the garden. Again, looking back to this dynamic staircase, and looking at this home workspace. The kids' den here, looking out over the garden. The kids' den is accessible via a sliding door, and then again you can see here. Garden studio. And then these are the existing spaces. You can see how we've removed the side of the wall, and this is the form of the extension. So you can see how the language of the existing building continues across into the extension. That's all from me. Sorry about some of those slides. I'm unsure of why they have formulas across them.
Yeah, no worries. I'm not sure if that was our end or what, but yeah, we got the point. It was a fantastic presentation, Lizzie, and a real testament to the different and creative and inventive ways for retrofitting our homes. So thank you for that presentation. We're now going to be moving into our panel discussion. So please do post any questions that you have. We're probably going to run over a little bit. I'm just warning you now. We've got two panelists joining our panel. That's Andrew Creamer, Director of Operation at Grosvenor, and Theo Manzaroli, Partner at Purcell. And I'm going to come to you first, Andrew. After hearing from today's presentations and from your own experience, can you tell us a bit more about the main challenges to retrofit period properties?
Can I start by saying I thought those were three excellent presentations. I've covered off a huge amount of what I was going to talk about, so clearly we're aligned, which is a great thing. So just to give people a bit of background on Grosvenor, Grosvenor owns a large number of properties in central London, about 3,000 plus, and about 40% of those properties are listed. So we've got quite a lot of experience of working with listed properties. We've been actively retrofitting our properties since about 2012, largely focusing on common part areas as opposed to the residential units themselves. But more recently, over the last 2 years, we've created a £90 million fund to retrofit our retail, commercial, and directly managed market let portfolio as well, so our residential portfolio as well. So we've got quite significant experience of doing it. What I will say is that I think there's some macro level problems that we need to tackle as a company, but there is also some standard practical level problems we've got to tackle as well. And Dougie and Marion, thank you. You've given me a good lead up to this. There was a lot in there. So from a macro level point of view, I think actually one of our biggest challenges is supply chain. So there is some limitations in terms of how many people are available to undertake works. We have just to give you an example, we've got 100,000 gas engineers in the UK and about 1,200 heat pump engineers. So you can see the scale of the problem that we've got in terms of transfer. Fortunately, we've got a lot of very capable people in gas engineers who are capable of retraining and doing heat pump installations. We're very fortunate because of the fact we've been working since 2012 on it, that we've upskilled our supply chain as we've gone along. But it does mean that is a problem. Second thing is that the knowledge associated with how to balance a property properly, and you've heard the complexities when Marion was talking about it earlier, the knowledge, understanding the different interventions you can make and the knock-on impacts associated with them isn't always there. So if you get, I think we all know when you get an EPC carried out with details of what the challenges are, the changes you can make to a property are, they're not all made of the same caliber. So there is a challenge there to try and upskill people so that they can understand how to balance things effectively. And the training around retrofitting that Marion was talking about, we've had to go through that with our team, and it makes a real difference to know how to challenge EPCs. We've also created our own, what we call a building performance evaluation, which looks at all the levels associated with what you might be able to do within a property, and tries to understand the most appropriate blend of those interventions to get the most effective operational carbon emission reduction. Cost. Doug, you talked about cost. Cost is also a significant issue. There's we are, again, Grosvenor is very fortunate in that we can take a long-term view over our portfolio. We've held it for 300 years. We can incur a commercial downside at the moment to be able to benefit in 20 years' time from future-proofing our portfolio. For other landlords, that's a challenge, and we don't get the same benefits from retrofitting existing stock that you would do from a new build, for example. So installing a heat pump in a new build, you get your VAT exempt, whereas doing a retrofit installation, you're not. So there's some challenges associated with that. One of the other ones that I think is really pertinent was the lessons learned and sharing of lessons learned. There's a lot of good examples of things that have been done. Great paper from Heritage England, the know your what was it called? Know Your House, Know Your Carbon. Yeah, which I think is a really good example of where we can put out information into the ether, where people have access to it and they're able to start taking decisions by themselves. I think the biggest point is trying to make it as easy as possible for people to do this without necessarily having the same backup that a lot of larger landlords and property owners might have. So that's probably most of the macro ones. There's one more, which is around the switch to electricity and the capacity of the grid, where we just have to be quite cautious about how swiftly we can move without upgrading of the infrastructure that's in place at the moment. From a practical point of view, one of the biggest challenges we had was upskilling our team. 10 years ago when we started this, the training programs that were available weren't as advanced as they are now. And a lot of it was self-learned. So we sent people to conferences, sustainability conferences, which were relatively rare in those days, but have certainly become more frequent. We've had we had a lot of pushback actually initially within the company in terms of how much we need to invest in the training side of it, but it's paid in dividends by doing that. Second challenge is existing infrastructure. So within a property, a heritage property, I think most people will know that they've been, because they're so adaptable, they have been knocked about over the years and cut in so many different ways that you don't necessarily know where utilities and electricity is going to run within your premises, which comes with its own challenges when you're looking to install new technologies and look at the capability of that premises. I can't remember who talked about it. I think it was Dougie, but understanding the embodied carbon decisions that you're taking is also one of those incredibly difficult challenges that we need to be able to tackle. And again, it comes back to the knowledge of being able to balance the decisions you're making to say, well, actually, what's going to have the most significant operational carbon impact, but also doesn't hinder us around embodied carbon. And then moving to heat pump installations, there's obviously a lot of ancillary work that needs to be done to be able to allow that to happen. So the costs associated with that can be quite prohibitive. And then you've got other commercial considerations around, if you're doing insulation installations on the internals of walls, if you're taking out some rentable floor space, if you're switching from a combi boiler to an electric boiler where you have a tank in place, actually that in some circumstances will take it out lettable floor space as well. So there, and then on top of that, just disrupting to tenants. So there are some challenges around it. What I will say is that all of them are surmountable, and you can very easily get around them with some research and some and the right amount of support in place. So although we've been doing it for going on 10 years now, initially it was challenging. It is becoming easier, and the awareness of people that this is something we need to do is definitely a thing that is going to support us in the next 5 years, 10 years of this program.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Now, Theo, we've heard quite a lot in this area, but I wanted to ask you to expand a bit more on some of the techniques that we can use to carry out low carbon interventions and make residential properties energy efficient.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to Marion and Lizzie and Doug. Really interesting to see what other people are doing and other fellow professionals in the industry are working on, and typical projects that we see every day at Purcell. Very similar. We obviously specialise and work in the heritage field and work with a lot of listed buildings. Not all of them residential. The residential elements we see, the residential projects we tend to work with are often single family homes, the larger central London properties, and some sort of rural properties which may not make up a huge percentage of the national housing stock, but we apply the same techniques and the same technical solutions to those sorts of projects as we do to our cultural projects and our public sector work projects. So in terms of the opportunities available to us, I think they've been described really well today, and there's a huge range of opportunities in terms of technical solutions, ranging from the upgrading of the fabric and the sort of the easy wins, if you like, such as roofs. They're generally a fairly easy win in terms of upgrading the thermal performance of roofs, floors, windows, particularly we've touched on in a lot of the detail there around what can be done to either enhance an existing historic window through use of fine slimline glazing or secondary glazing elements, but also what needs to be reiterated, I suppose, is the challenge we face of balancing the upgrades with the heritage significance and the understanding, really, the sort of key issues around the listed building. And it's that balance that we face and have to work with on a sort of daily basis. And the challenges that we often come across are how to persuade the conservation officers that we can make alterations to the building to upgrade the fabric while protecting the significance of those spaces. So we are limited in many ways, but we can't dismantle fine historic interiors. I think at the In and Out Club, Marion was showing a rather wonderful interior. That's quite typical of the project work we may face, where some of the solutions will have to be focused and limited on areas of the building that are adaptable and able to change. And I think it all stems from understanding of the buildings. We spend a lot of time and effort investigating the buildings with specialist consultants and surveyors, understanding the performance of the fabric, undertaking opening up works and measuring existing constructions and understanding exactly how the building's built, and then working through alternative solutions and testing those with suppliers and, again, specialists, and modelling the building to understand the thermal performance throughout the year as well, to understand how the environmental changes externally impact on the building. So it's a suite of alterations that can be applied to each building, but you do have to sort of work around the whole building as an entirety and look at each opportunity and adjust that to suit the significance of the historic building and the value, the cost. Spatial constraints as well, we touched on, I think earlier, the heat pumps solution, replacing or removing gas-fired boilers from a lot of buildings requires the replacement of those, what were fairly small components, with much larger components that take up space. And there are other challenges there around where to locate those externally, usually, whether they're sort of in external courtyards at rooftop level. All of these issues come into play and have an impact in terms of planning and our ability to secure consents for quite difficult solutions. I think that the local authorities, particularly in Westminster, and I'm sure Andrew will be very familiar with this, you have to bring along the conservation officer on the journey with you. And there is a move now. I do feel that the conservation officers and the local planning authorities are less resistant to change. There used to be a very much, you can't do that, you know, changing a window, upgrading a window, putting in secondary glazing. There's a lot of things that were once resisted as a sort of almost just like straight away blanket, no, you can't do it. But there's now a conversation, a dialogue, and it's finding, I think as we move through the years, we've got to find a better way of balancing, obviously, heritage, asset and value with the need to improve our existing building stock, because it can't stay as it is and needs to develop.
Thank you very much, Theo. You will all have noticed we're a little bit over time, but I am going to pick up a couple of audience questions. If you have to go, apologies, but this will be on the recording afterwards. So Marion, actually, it's quite helpful that you've answered some of those questions already. Normally we like to tackle them on the call, but there is a couple I'm going to try and distill into one or two questions. So there was one question here around the metrics we use to demonstrate a successful retrofit project. And one of the audience said, surely EPC is not the answer. And that leads into another question just around government incentives and policies that I want to pick up. But maybe, Dougie, did you have any thoughts on the metrics and how we measure a good retrofit?
Well, our Historic England, our technical conservation team, are sort of working alongside BEIS and EPC in relation to the EPC measures, and making sure that something which is perhaps, I'm not going to say not fit for purpose, but it's something that needs amending and needs to change. So we're sort of engaging with BEIS around that. Like for me personally, one of the key metrics is that whatever we do retrofit measures wise is that it lasts, and that it lasts for as long as it can and should do. And I think there's a bigger conversation around the likes of repair and maintenance and people being engaged with their homes, and also what's required to make sure that this big sort of carbon investment into retrofit, which it will be, to ensure that it meets its life, that we don't get 15 years down the line and we're having to, because it hasn't been properly maintained and looked after, that we're sort of losing those things. So for me, one of the key metrics is that it lasts for as long as it can and should do. But yeah, there's lots of conversations going about EPC and those other elements, and I'd agree EPC as it currently isn't right, but there's certainly other things to do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on the EPC piece? We can move on. Okay, so the other piece is just around, we've had the local authorities mentioned, but and actually, Marion, you mentioned GLA guidance coming out. Andrew, you mentioned your building performance evaluation. What can government do? You know, is it around incentives? Is it around changing policy? And in that similar vein, organisations like NLA, you know, we try and bring together as many people as possible to affect change, and whether there's a role that we would have to play. But perhaps, Marion, if I can come to you first on that.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that they could really do is reduce the VAT on deep retrofits down to 0% to give a great incentive. At the moment, there is zero incentive, and for example, on a continent, it's in reverse. You have 0% on refurbishment and much higher VAT on new build. It's the opposite in our country, and that's not in the favour of the retrofit mission that we need to address, really. So that would be my number one request, I would say. Then there's also lots of other incentives that could be brought in, such as grants or cheap loans, or for the implementation of the integration of air source heat pump, for example. Also incentives when people are replacing kitchens or other elements of their house, to take that opportunity to look at a bigger picture of their whole house, not just one element that they're addressing at that time. Or roof extension, for example. I think there's lots of missed opportunities there. So I would say incentives to have a bigger impact at these moments.
Thanks, Marion. Did anyone else want to address that one on the government's role?
I think I would just reiterate the fact that yeah, the sort of VAT on listed building works. It's just it is ironic, really, that alterations to the historic fabric still actually require VAT.
I think I completely agree with you, Theo. I think there is there's another thing in here around, and you talked about planning and local authorities, and the hoops that it's some authorities you have to jump through to be able to get on with these sort of works. There is something around creating consistency of how things are applied, so that people know before they start going through planning exactly what they should be able to do and what they shouldn't be able to do, and because it is so inconsistent, it makes it very difficult for the industry to be able to push on and move this forwards. So I think that's probably another thing, creating that consistency in planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think advice within their own departments, it's a sort of finding a way to get the message from, how sort of they're quite segmented and compartmentalized, the sort of local authorities, and silo working and all that sort of thing. And it's finding a way to ensure that the policy is amended, but also that the message gets through to the case officers who are out every day meeting us and the teams out there on projects, because we just get such a varied response depending on who you talk to, and have battles about things that around the corner weren't an issue. It's sort of frustrating, as I'm sure we all experience.
Lizzie, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I also, we work with householders a lot, so we're not working on huge kind of commercial buildings or with experienced clients. The education piece for me is as critical. I mean, the VAT is just hands down. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. But we're working on projects for clients that want to spend £150,000, £400,000. When you take out, Dougie, on your slide, the cost of an average terraced house, a small terraced house, is 41,000. Presumably that's plus VAT before they've got any of the things that they associate with the things that they're going to enjoy experiencing. There has to be something to done with the costs or the education. And also, we work on lots of projects, but a huge amount of people refurbishing their homes don't use an architect. So accountability is of the actual builders as well. That there's very little accountability or education with that respect. So I think something that just goes beyond architects and the full building profession plus homeowners, and education piece is essential.
Thanks. You just opened up a huge can of worms right at the end of the event there, Lizzie. So I think we should probably leave it there. We are a little bit over. Thank you all for joining. And of course, thank you to all our speakers. Really, really fantastic presentations. The video recording will go up on the website, as well as the presentations. We are going to finish off with just a short poll for the audience to give us some feedback on the session. It's really useful for us for planning future events. Again, thank you all for joining, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.